First of all, just want to apologize about the lighting of this video. It's an unfortunate uh, you know uh, event that happens as a result of what we're going through in South Africa. It is load shedding, so unfortunately where I am, I do not have proper backup lighting that would help me with such a reality that has basically become part of our reality as South Africa. So please do bear with me in this poor lighting quality that we basically have in our midst. Okay, so with that out of the way, I just wanted to basically inform you that we now likely moving to the topic of second-hand goods, but in this regard we're making emphasis of the topic of fixed property being second-hand. But before we basically touch on that topic specifically, I just want to basically trigger your mind in saying that since the topic is still on second hands, we still have to be very cautious in terms of the requirements that we have to look out for. Just as we elaborated with second-hand goods, those requirements that must be a present feature in us having an ideal second-hand situation arising where notional input VAT would likely be claimable is that maybe just to recap a bit more about those requirements, that firstly you need to basically have a good on second-hand good that was previously used and owned, and that good would likely have to be, it would have to be used for a taxable supply, and the seller of that actual good must have been within South Africa, and there must have been a resident within South Africa as well, and basically there would have not been actual VAT which was basically levied on that actual item, albeit a good. So that's what we basically have to be mindful of. So with those same requirements, you can actually filter them through to second and fixed property. So those same requirements are also required, and those would also deem that particular property second-hand property. And just be very aware as well that second-hand fixed property either relates to land or building, so that's what we mean by fixed property. It either relates to land or building, whereas in the former instance we're talking about movable goods, whereas with fixed property we're talking about immovable goods. So with fixed property, what you also would be likely poised to deal with is a scenario that would likely arise if there's a transaction that happens from a non-vendor's perspective, where we would likely claim notional input VAT if we're obviously registered and we've determined that the actual transaction fits within the actual requirements of that particular fixed property being deemed to be a second-hand fixed property. So in that instance, there would likely be transfer duty to consider over and above the fact that there's now that whole thing of second-hand of notional input VAT having to also come into that equation. So be very mindful of that. I must be honest in saying that I tussled a bit with this at first because I was basically almost at a contradicting point when I'm basically just trying to figure out, why is it that I would likely be paying transfer duties if I was buying this item from a non-vendor, and over and above me paying transfer duties, I was also claiming notional input as well. So for me it was a bit of a complex one. I was like, caught up. I was doing it, and I was basically saying like, yeah, this is the actual logic, but at the same time, I was getting somewhat confused, and I took a back seat a bit, and I kind of like tried to think from like a different perspective, and it made me realize that we must always try to take a back seat and actually just try to figure out as to why other principles would have to be applicable. Because like, if we're to simplify a situation where we're buying fixed property from a VAT vendor, we're dealing with fixed property that is taxable supply, and we on that buying side we also VAT vendors. In a normal transaction, if we're buying an asset from a normal vendor, and I'm also a normal vendor as well on the buying side, there actually be like VAT output being levied by the actual seller, and me on the one end as the buyer, I'll be claiming input VAT. In that instance, there would be a net effect, right? This would be the actual basis of that transaction. So just as we elaborated with the second-hand goods part, where there's a non-vendor now, whereas we the actual VAT vendors on the one side, so we registered VAT vendor, but we're buying from a non-vendor, so that would have likely meant to say that there was no VAT being levied on the actual transaction. So in that instance, we'd have to recognize notional input VAT, so as to be able to claim back for our notional input, So when we are looking at it very carefully, and it will become a very important conversation as we go forward as well, is that when we're buying second-hand goods, we're actually better off buying from a non-vendor, because in that instance there's a bit of an advantage for us, because think about it from a perspective of SARS. They've not gotten their output VAT from the actual seller, and whereas we were able to claim back notional input VAT from the buying perspective as us being buyers, and as a result we don't have a net effect, because we're actually getting an additional advantage, because we kind of like getting input VAT for VAT that is not paid by us. So in that instance, it's actually an advantage for us to actually be buying second-hand goods from non-vendors when dealing with goods. So now, when I've kind of like related this to the same situation, but now with second-hand fixed property, which now introduces transfer duty if there's no VAT being levied, it kind of like made me realize that no, man, it's not like SARS was being unreasonable. In actual fact, where there's going to be transfer duties, it would likely mean that there was no actual output VAT being levied by the actual seller, because the seller would have likely been a non-vendor. And as a result, SARS goes on to say that if there's no VAT that was levied by the actual seller, then that means there would likely be notional input that we claim, but at the same time that would also give rise to transfer duties having to be payable, and transfer duty is the actual responsibility of the buyer, so he'd have to pay transfer duties. And so that would mean we've claimed notional input, but at the same time we're paying transfer duties. So that transfer duty, from the perspective of SARS, it acts as like a VAT of some sort, which is an output VAT of some sort, because it's actually a tax which is payable by the actual buyer. So it kind of like made sense. I was like, wow, this actually makes sense, So that's why they'd say in a situation of having to buy second-hand goods, they'd say the only instance where you're able to claim more than you actually bought for is when you're dealing with second-hand goods. and that made sense from perspective of dealing with second input where you'd have claimed in notional input VAT. I hope this makes sense. It must really make sense, because like for me it was like, wow, it's a penny dropped kind of like moment when I kind of like, interacted with this particular direction of transaction from these two different scenarios. So yeah, with fixed property, be very cautious. So now that if I can just paint the picture now, just as I've already hinted, giving you a few hints. So with fixed property, what happens is you're buying from a VAT vendor, so if there's no VAT being levied by the actual seller, and you as the buyer, you actually registered VAT vendor, you'd be compelled to actually pay transfer duties, but you can still claim your notional input VAT, of course, so be very aware of that. Whereas if the actual seller is a registered VAT vendor and we on the buying side are also registered, in that instant there'll be just a normal flow of transaction in terms of the direction, that being, your your VAT upon having been like levied by the actual seller, and we as the actual buyers would have actually claimed normal VAT in that particular instance. So there would not be any reason for transfer duty to arise, because there's VAT. So where there's VAT, there's no transfer duty. Where there's no transfer duty, where there's no VAT, it's gonna give rise to transfer duty. So be very aware of those prevalent features coming about. And yeah, we'll get into a few scenarios, and we basically just try paint this picture. And once again, sorry about the lighting. I do not know if this will be an ideal way to showcase what we're trying to drill home on the whiteboard. Give it a try. If it doesn't work, we just have to wait for electricity to actually come back. Alright then.